All right. Well, I just want to welcome everybody here today. We're really excited for everybody. First of all, for our presenters to give us some great information, but also really to have as much interaction and discussion as possible today on best practices that you guys are seeing in diversity recruiting and anything you're having trouble with, questions you want answered. So hopefully we'll have lively discussion here, and to those joining us by live stream, they feel free to tweet at Recruit Diverse, and we will be watching the stream to look for any questions that you might want answered. The presenters will speak for about 15 minutes and then have a discussion afterwards. And I just want to thank the three companies that are working together as partners in this conference. Today, College Recruiter, which my name is Faith Rockford, and I'm the CEO of College Recruiter. And then we have Stinson Leonard Street, who is being a wonderful host here today, and WCN, who is a partner in this as well. And so I just want to thank everybody. I would like to offer a disclaimer. Make sure that we have a disclaimer that says this recording is designed to provide general information only. It is not intended to be a comprehensive summary of the law or to treat exhaustively the subjects covered. This information does not constitute legal advice or opinion. Legal advice or opinion are provided by Stinson Leonard Street LLP only upon engagement with respect to specific factual situations, and never from me. So with that, I'd like to introduce Anna Peters. She's our first presenter, and she's from College Recruit. Hi, everyone. Is this working? Is this on?
No.
You might be able to see me. There we go.
There you go.
Okay, so I'm Anna. I'm with College Recruiter. I'm glad you could make it here today. Great. So I'm going to talk about why diversity matters, because that's the right thing we want to start with first, to get us all on the same page. And I think that here we go. Probably everyone in this room has heard at least a little bit about why diversity matters. You've heard maybe some claims, some of the research, the numbers. So we'll talk about that. I'll run through a couple studies that I thought were worthy of highlighting so that we all have kind of a shared understanding of what the impact of diversity can be. But I also want to go through the how. So how diversity matters. What is supposed to happen when you get diversity in the door? What is the magic that the research says happens? And especially I want to go through that because you might be seeing the research and hearing what the claim is, but what if your experience tells you otherwise? What if it doesn't match what you think other organizations are enjoying? And then I'll wrap up with a little bit of what do you do now? All of that, given all that, what am I supposed to do with this information? So here's the claim, right? Diversity leads to greater profit and innovation. In fact, workplace diversity is among the most important predictors of a business's sales revenue, customer numbers, and profitability. That's a finding from a study out of the University of Illinois in Chicago, authored by Cedric Gearing. And I'll go through four or five different major findings that this study published. So first of all, the most racially diverse companies that they reviewed they had 15 times more sales revenue than the least racially diverse companies. Gender diversity accounted for almost $600 million in average sales revenue. And this is an encouraging finding because we're seeing incremental impact. So even if you make small efforts, you should see small impact. And the more effort you make, the more impact you should see. So they found that every percentage increase in racial and gender diversity equated to 9% and 3% increase in sales revenue. Customer numbers also increased. So again, small increases in racial and gender diversity resulted in 400 more customers and 200 more customers. So that was one study. Here's another one out of McKinsey, and they found that gender diverse organizations were 15% more likely to outperform, and racially, for ethnically diverse organizations, were 35% more likely to outperform than the least diverse organizations. And that they also found a linear relationship. So this is encouraging because, again, there's no tipping point, there's no bar that you have to meet in order to start seeing results. They also found for every 10% increase in racial and ethnic diversity at the senior level, sales increased, earnings increased before interest and taxes, about 0.8%. And I want to make another point here because we're measuring, most of the research is focused on race and ethnicity and gender because they're really easy to measure, right? People are used to being asked those questions. Age, too, is easy to measure. But I would, if I were you, I would assume, and I'm not an academic, but for practical purposes, I would assume that so many other dimensions of diversity also have a similar impact. So sexual orientation, we don't typically ask that, although that's in the news and it might come up later. Personality is harder to measure, right? There's a way, but it costs money. Personal experiences, diversity of personal experiences, what people bring behind them, where do they come from in their last jobs, where do they used to live? All those different dimensions of diversity. If I were you, practically speaking, I would assume that they also matter. They can also make a difference. All right, so what happens if, you've heard this before, you know you're supposed to be seeing an impact from diversity in the door, in your workplace, but your experience just doesn't match that. And you start to see a different picture emerge. Maybe you have been successful in getting diversity in the door, in recruiting diversity, but then what happens? Do you see communication breakdown? Do you see interpersonal issues crop up? Do you see group dynamics start to go south a little bit? Communication suffering? Maybe you've seen legal issues, discrimination claims. And that costs a lot of money, it costs a lot of time, and it certainly lowers morale. So if this, at least in part, represents some of your concerns, this is what perhaps you're worried about, it's not necessarily an illusion. Diversity can be a source of mistrust, right? If you are interacting with somebody who seems different from you, maybe you feel like you just have to, chip away a little bit before you start to trust them. Diversity can be a source of discomfort. Again, if you're not comfortable with someone because they look different, they act different, they talk different, they seem different, you may not be comfortable with them right away. So this is not an illusion. This is human stuff. Oops. It can be a source of resentment. Frankly, diversity can be a source of conflict. So it's important to acknowledge that. Which is why I want to go into a little bit of how. So if diversity is supposed to be so magical and have this big impact, what exactly is supposed to happen? So let's get a little bit into the psychology behind it. Diversity is a catalyst for creativity and deep thinking. What diversity does, it spurs deeper information processing. It spurs complex thinking. We make higher quality decisions. And that happens because when you're in a diverse group, everybody has access to now a greater variety of perspectives. If you're sitting there among a diverse team, you are now listening to different people's opinions, or different opinions that maybe brush up against what you thought, or maybe it conflicts with what you would have heard otherwise. Maybe you don't agree with them. So that's what's going on and what causes the deeper information processing. I'm going to throw a few interesting studies out here that I thought were worth mentioning. There was a study in 2006 where the researchers created these mock juries. They put the participants on these juries and said, okay, now you're a juror. I think it was a team of 4. And they had different juries where it was diverse, and I believe it was racially diverse, 2 white and 2 black jurors. And then they had homogenous juries, all black and all white. And they told them to deliberate these facts and discuss. And what they found was, on the diverse juries, The white jurors considered more case facts. They considered those facts more carefully. They deliberated more. They made fewer errors compared to the homogenous, or compared to the white jurors on their homogenous juries. What makes this so hard for all of us, or many of us, to really truly and internally with all of ourselves really get on the bandwagon and believe all of this is because homogenous teams just feel easier. They feel more effective. And it makes a lot of sense. Has anyone heard of the fluency heuristic? The fluency heuristic says that we like to, or we prefer to process information that is familiar and easy. And it just makes a lot of sense. I mean, how much information is flying by our eyes and our faces every minute? Thousands of bits of information. And our brains just don't want to have to work that hard. We have to select what we choose. We have to choose what we want to process, and we choose the information that is easier and familiar to us. So it's human. It makes a lot of sense. In fact, the people, we feel less effective when we're in a diverse group. When we're on a diverse team, we just judge our own effectiveness as less. So the research tells us that that's not necessarily true, right? Like diverse teams are supposed to be more effective, but the perception matters. That perception is there. Another study I want to show you about, or tell you about, in 2009, they gave participants a video to watch and a transcript to read, and they're watching these teams, again, diverse teams and homogeneous teams. And they're watching these teams discuss. I don't know what the topic was, but they were discussing something related to business needs. And the participants had to watch these videos and read the transcripts and then evaluate how much conflict these teams had amongst themselves and allocate resources depending on how much they felt their needs were worth the resources. So study participants who were watching a diverse group, a diverse team, evaluated them as having more conflict than the participants who were evaluating a homogeneous team. What they didn't know, that you can probably guess, is that the two teams were verbatim exactly the same. The transcripts were exactly the same. They were discussing the exact same thing. So what's left is our perceptions are telling us we're perceiving these diverse teams as having more conflict. And then I should have said also what the study participants were allocating fewer resources to those diverse teams. So here's an example of how our perceptions and our biases actually have a very real economic impact. We overly trust people who are like us, who we perceive as like us. We think that they're kind of the same. And that's a whole different conversation, assuming somebody is just like us because they look the same and they talk the same. Another story, interesting story out of a study, this was the University of Texas. They gave their study participants the job of guessing at the values of these simulated stocks. So how much do you think these stocks are valued at? And they took their individual answers, and then these participants were supposed to buy and sell within a group. They were supposed to be trading these stocks. And again, we're looking at a diverse group of people buying and selling, and then a homogeneous team of people buying and selling. Here's what they found. The traders, the participants who were interacting with a diverse group, their answers to the stock prices were 58% more accurate. So they're much more likely to get close to the true value of those stocks, those simulated stocks. And as they interacted with the people around them, with those diverse, in their diverse group, their performance increased. And they were using real money. They had a real stake in the game, so they actually wanted to get their answers right. And what I think is particularly interesting is that over here on the homogeneous team, the people who were buying and selling with people who they perceive as this kind of the same as them, those people, and this gets back to overly trusting, those people copied and imitated people around them in the wrong direction. They were placing undue trust in the answers and the perceptions of the people around them because They figured they were right. They figured, you're like me, I trust you, which gets faster back to the mistrust. And it makes me think, when we walked in this office this afternoon, the door was locked. And there was a man who let us in, and he said, well, you guys look trustworthy. And I thought, that's pretty nice, nicely dressed, middle-class women who don't look threatening, overly trusting. We didn't do anything wrong. We didn't break anything. But we trust people because they seem like us. And sometimes, or oftentimes, at least in a business case, that doesn't spur that information processing, that deep thinking, the complex thinking, that will release some of that creativity and the impact that we talked about in the beginning. The cognitive friction, that mistrust. It feels less effective, it feels hard, but it is good for business. Good for interaction. So, conflict is normal, right? But the key, of course, is how do you manage it? If companies want their young, diverse talent to become the next generation of leaders, they need to create a culture that truly embraces diverse opinions, perspectives, and lifestyles. Done. No, way easier said than done. So we're making way more effort now than we ever have to build a pipeline of diversity. Many, many more organizations are doing it, and they're cognizant of that. So great, that's good news. We're getting more diversity in the door, but what we're not seeing yet is that diversity is not yet getting promoted to leadership. So what does that tell us? It tells us that we don't know how to focus on inclusion. At least most of us don't yet. And without focusing on inclusion, your diverse talent is going to walk out the door. They may not feel respected, they may not feel like they belong, they may not feel like they're being heard. And again, the key here is that your diverse talent has to feel like they can express their unique perspective. That's ultimately what you care about. Perspective taking is key here. And what I mean by perspective taking is essentially, and very simply, putting yourselves in somebody else's shoes. Imagining somebody else's point of view, which seems very simple, but it is powerful, because when you take somebody else's, or you imagine somebody else's point of view, it can smooth out interpersonal interaction. It can reduce bias. When you ask your team members to consider each other's perspectives, that can be a really powerful thing and start to unleash that potential that your diversity has. So again, people have to feel respected and welcome before they feel free to express their opinions. The key here is not to take a kumbaya approach. If your organization's culture embraces difference as opposed to ignoring difference, then you're allowing people to really express their opinion and feel free to be themselves. And again, unlock that potential. If your mentality is, and then, the Minnesotans in this room will understand where I'm coming from. If your mentality is, I love everyone, I don't care if you are blue, green, pink, or gray, I love you all the same. You're all the same word in my heart. That's not helping. You have to get to the point where you can genuinely say, you know what, I like what some of these blue people bring to the table. I like what some of those pink people are saying. I like what the green people have to offer sometimes. That's more genuine, and that way you are embracing diversity, and you're embracing difference, you're welcoming difference, and you're encouraging it to come out. And that's a really key stepping stone, maybe one of the first stepping stones to creating an inclusive environment. I think with that, we can open it up for discussion. So if people have questions or experiences that they want to share, I welcome that.
All right, so Anna, how do we prioritize diversity recruitment, and how do some of the people in the room, I guess actually asking everybody, how do you prioritize diversity recruitment, and do you have a problem that even though you're trying to prioritize it, it's just not happening? You're not even finding those diverse candidates in the first place to interview.
So I'll repeat the question, especially for the folks online.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And tell me if I'm getting this right or not right. Especially for talent acquisition and HR, who obviously, not obviously, but many people say they care about diversity recruitment. They want diverse talent, but somehow it never makes it to that priority list. Mm-hmm. Or it's always on the priority list, but it never gets perhaps the right support or the right investment. I'm curious to hear anybody's experience in this room.
I was on another call today, and they were talking about making sure you're getting the word out in the right places. Because as a white female, you go, oh, I don't do this, or I would do this. But that's not what everything's doing. So we have to figure out what audience you're trying to draw in, and then think about how they would get that information.
Right. You have to think about where your audience is, right? And one point I guess I want to make is, I think a lot of HR professionals or people in general are afraid to target. And I hope that you should give yourself permission to target, because if you want different people in the door, if you want people who bring in different perspectives, you have to do something different. And targeting is not bad. You have to do your research to find where those people are. If you're looking for women engineers, if you're looking for Spanish speakers, if you're looking, you name it, and what you're doing is not working, you have to give yourself the permission to target and do something different to find different people. And to get back to the question of how to prioritize, everything you should always start with data. If you don't have data that tells you our diversity talent, how long do they stick around? Do we feel like we're losing? We have an attrition problem? Do you feel like it? Do you know it? What is your data? What data tell you that your diverse hires are any different than the workplace as a whole? Because if you do a little bit of research and you do say, exit interviews, but also stay interviews, right? So people who are employed still and you think they're still happy, collect some data, find out what are their pain points before they head out the door. Collect data, and then you start to draw a picture of what your problem is, if you have a problem. And only then can you start to build, say a diversity retention program. Other people's experience about diversity recruitment or prioritizing? Anybody else want to share?
Anna, just to piggyback on what you're saying, I don't think you could take a one-size-fits-all approach to different diverse communities. We say diversity, 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 and then you lump in women and African Americans and Latinos and people who are LGBT, and each group actually needs a different strategy to bring them in the door.
Each group, and this is why it's so hard to wrap our heads around this, is because each individual has different experiences. And if what you're seeing is, let's say, an attrition problem, and you're losing your diverse talent, you cannot put everyone in the same bucket. And you can't even put people who you're really tempted to put in that same drop-down selection into the same bucket. You have to do more research into why this person is not feeling engaged. Why is this person leaving? Why is that person not speaking up in meetings? So your managers are really, really, really essential in engaging their staff and getting to know where their pain points are. Because ultimately, again, what you really want to get, the point you want to get to is where everybody, including your diverse talent, feels free to speak their perspective. Because that's where you get that, the people are forced to consider different perspectives.
One of the things I hear people talk about, when it comes to the inability to retain diverse talent is you kind of need a critical mass. You need, enough so that folks don't feel like they're singled out, they're the token, whatever. And I mean, some communities are less diverse, and it is a little more difficult to have that critical mass of folks. I mean, how would you recommend dealing with that sort of situation? I mean, you could try to hire a whole lot of people and do it all at once, but that's got its own challenges. How do you address that? Need to make those people feel welcome when maybe they are a smaller percentage.
So I have a thought, but I'm encouraged. Does anyone else have a reaction to that? Nobody likes to feel like a token, but you're right, it can be intimidating. I would focus on other dimensions of diversity that are harder to measure, because then when you get something, when you wrap your mind and you get on board with some sort of diversity, and we're talking about personality, we're talking about experiences, age, what else? Ability, I mean, body shape, So wrap your mind around something so you're not just focusing on skin color, for example. And then once you start to identify those dimensions of diversity, then you can start to build that culture of inclusion, which is a huge initiative, right? It's not just, we're gonna build a culture of inclusion. But if you have something that you can work with, then you should be able to move forward and take those dimensions of diversity into account and build your culture around that, so that when you have your tokens, right? People who feel like tokens walk in the door and it's a more obvious dimension of diversity, like skin color, you've already built this foundation of inclusion. And in theory, your people will be more welcoming and you won't lose your talent so quickly.
And I think building on that, and we're really talking about engaging the employee base, and we're talking about the recruiting piece of it. I think it's really important to, it's not when that candidate is applying to a specific role. It's like starting to have these pipelines and engaging with potential candidates before you have a role. Personalizing that process, that message to them as you're talking about whatever group they're in. I think that's really key. And so if you can start to have whether it's through technology or just one-on-one reaching out, but having that pipeline of diverse talents and marketing emails or whatnot, like that helps a ton. So by the time a role opens up that they're a good fit for, they've gotten to know you already in your organization. So I think that's another way to really help to increase the diverse hires.
On engagement, I think thank you for bringing that up, because all of your employees want to feel valued. All of your employees want to feel like they're heard and they're contributing. So that's not unique to diverse hires. Everybody wants to feel valued. So engaging every individual is to find out what are their strengths, what do they need to build, and what are the gaps. And this is an important point where if let's just say in your workplace you have a dominant culture of white male. And a white male dominant culture is afforded some advantages where you walk in the door and people may trust you a little bit more instantly, right? Or you have a good network around you just because of that, the culture of trust around you. But recognize that if somebody does not fit that dominant culture, there's a gap there. And so their manager, again, is really key in helping them. So what's missing to help to engage you the most? Do you need a mentor to feel more networked, to feel more supported? Do you not feel like people trust you? Let's come up with a plan. Let me talk to find out what those gaps are so that they can feel as engaged as people from that dominant culture. And I think with that, I'm being... are any other comments that people want to make in the last couple minutes?
Don't forget your allies. I think even if you don't belong to a particular demographic, if you genuinely care and can just convey that you genuinely care, that goes a long way with any group.
Thank you for coming.
everyone.
Hi.
Oh,
I'm Jenrette-Thomas. I'm the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer here at Stinson Leonard Street. And I'm really excited to be with all of you virtually and in person. So today, what I'm going to talk about, and it's a great second step to what Anna has already started to explain, the reason why diversity is important. But now let's talk about how do you get rid of bias in hiring, right? So, implicit bias. That is the underlying thing that ends up creating problems in the hiring process. And so most people are like, okay, what is implicit bias? And some of you may have heard it by a different term, unconscious bias. And essentially, it is just think of it as shortcuts in your brain. It's mental processes that help you figure out how to quickly categorize information so that your brain can function optimally. So, you're probably like, I don't get it. How is bias optimally functioning? Well, here's how. Remember earlier Anna was saying that there are lots of information coming at you. Well, in actuality, it's over 1 million pieces of information per second. This is information you're gathering from all of your senses. It's information that you're gathering, from, like in this very moment, your brain is detecting so much, but in order for it to be optimal, it can't focus on 1 million pieces of information. So the brain is devised in this brilliant way. There is the prefrontal cortex from the brain, and that part is the slow brain. But it's the slow brain that actually that is necessary for critical thinking, for changing anything. And then eventually, there's if you do the slow brain activity enough, it gets married or buried into the reptilian brain, the fast brain, the unconscious brain. The crazy thing is, because it's unconscious and because it's happening so rapidly, your conscious mind can't even detect when something unconscious is happening. Like right now, if you focus your attention on it, you'll start to realize, oh, I'm breathing. Oh yeah, that's happening, like every second, right? But if you're not thinking about it, it's still happening. So that's an example. And I like to give this example too. You guys remember when you first started to drive? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You're all focused and tense. I'm at 2 o'clock, at 10 o'clock, and I gotta make sure that I'm, I gotta do this right so I pass the exam and whatnot. Now, how many of you have found yourself in your car and somehow you ended up home, right? And you don't even realize what happened. You're just like, oh wait, I was on the phone, or I was thinking about my day and the grocery list, and how did I end up here? Well, that is an example of when you were learning, your slow brain was at work. And then when you got to the point where it's automatic, that's your fast brain. Make sense? Yep. All right, so when it comes to hiring, some of the things that's embedded in the unconscious part, the slow brain, the fast brain, are cultural norms. And so I want to give you an example of different styles of what's valued in different cultures and how that in and of itself can impact hiring. So for example, leadership. When you think of leadership, give me some descriptions of words that you associate with leadership. Decisive. What else?
confident.
Confident. Anything else? Okay, that's good enough. Decisive. Confident. Now, that is a US-based version of what's considered a good leader. What's happened now is that we have so many multinational corporations, and a lot of them are headquartered in the US. And then when people in order to advance, if they're stationed in a different country, in order to advance, typically they need to do a stint in the US so that they can, have the right qualifications, so they can move up the corporate ladder. But in Asia, they call that stint the killing fields. Because in Asian culture, what is valued as a leader is someone who is collaborative, someone who is consensus building, so really much more quiet. And it's a different type of confidence, but it looks vastly different than what leadership looks like here. So they are in a double bind. They have to come here, or else they're not going to go up the corporate ladder. But once they come here, their leadership style prevents them from getting up the corporate ladder. So that's one example, but you can see, and this is a little hard, this graphic, but there's everything from body language and eye contact. There's just so many different dimensions that impact how your mind, your brain, is processing whether someone is a good fit. How many of you have heard that, right? So now, let's talk about the various types of biases that could be present in the hiring process specifically. Anna already mentioned like me, right? That's what affinity bias is. I like people, and I tend to gravitate toward people like me. Confirmation bias. That is essentially when you either put a magnifying lens on things that confirm what you already think, or you kind of put a minimizing lens on things that contradict what you already think. Great example, this last election. The people that were supporting Hillary probably put a minimizing lens on whatever was good about Trump and vice versa, right? I know that was controversial, but attribution bias. So attribution bias is essentially when you give a more favorable assessment to somebody that is in your in-group. Now, what defines that in-group? It could be a variety of things. It all depends. That's where that individuality comes into play. But you tend to favor those that are in your in-group and not as much those who are not in that group. Availability bias. That's basically what is quick and easy, top-of-mind information that I can retrieve. So in the case of when a site, well, no, I'm talking about hiring. So let's think about an example. Firefighter. Get an image in your mind. Okay. For those of you, how many people had an image of a woman firefighter? There is 0 people in this audience that had that, right? So the top-of-mind assumption is that a firefighter is a male. Yeah. Thank you. Implicit stereotypes. This is basically when people judge based on the stereotypes, and it's important to know that stereotypes, we get them from a variety of things. It could be from the media, it could be from old, Uncle Johnny telling you these stories, and all of a sudden you have this perception about a group of people. It could be watching from All in the Family. Just anything. There's so many different, opportunities to develop stereotypes. In-group favoritism is very similar to affinity bias. And finally, Anna had alluded to this earlier, the notion of groupthink, where people are not willing to go against the grain of the homogeneous group. So here is a study to show you about what's happened in both. This study was done in law firms and in corporations. And the study was identical resumes, one for a person named Emily, one for a person named Lakeisha, and then a similar identical resumes for Greg and Jamal. So, who's surprised? Is anybody surprised here? The evidence pointed that there's a 50% gap in callback rate between the white-sounding names, so 1 out of 10, versus the black-sounding names. Now, what this essentially boils down to is the equivalent of an additional 8 years of experience when you, with respect to the individuals with the white sounding names. Here's another interesting study that kind of explains confirmation bias in the context of the law. And for those of you who deal with lawyers, we love to think that we are really unbiased and objective. And so, this study is particularly interesting because there was a memo written, same memo. It was written by prestigious partners, 6 of them, or five or six of them, and then with some deliberate errors in there. And it was distributed to 60 attorneys at different law firms to say, oh, this is a third-year student, want you to evaluate their writing sample. Half the participants that were told that it was a Caucasian individual, the other half were told that it was an African-American, same school, same year, everything. Same memo, remember that. So, here's what the study found. Essentially, there were fewer errors detected with Caucasian Thomas's memo, and a lot more detected and edits made with the African-American Thomas's memo. So again, there is a bias in not just the legal world, but there's a stereotype that that African Americans might not have as strong writing skills in comparison to Caucasians. And that's what was being magnified or minimized here. Okay, so enough explaining. Now it's time to get to action. Figure out how do you do something about this. Number 1, education. It all starts with you. If you don't know your own biases or the fact that we're prone to them, then you're not going to be able to help the system at all. And it's not just with respect to you. You have to also educate the people that are involved in the hiring process. One great tool is the implicit association test, and everybody should take it. There's plenty, there's a variety of tests on there. Just go to projectimplicit.org. It's free, but it just gives you a baseline of, where am I on this particular issue? And take some time to become culturally competent. Learning about different cultures, what, for example, does leadership look like in that particular culture, might help you to de-bias the hiring process when it comes to conversing about an individual. Next, assess your entire hiring process with the assumption that implicit bias is there. Why? Because statistically speaking, it's there. So, it's important to recognize that it could be present in where you post for jobs, how the descriptions are actually written, who and how the resumes are reviewed, going back to the Emily and Lakeisha examples, how the interviews are conducted, and who conducts the interviews. So, how do you review your job descriptions for bias? Well, there are certain words and phrases in a job description that could lead to fewer diverse applicants because they will self-select out. Specifically, there are studies have shown that women are less likely to apply for a job where there are masculine coded language, whereas the flip is not true. Men are negligibly affected when it comes to feminine coded language. Let me give you some examples. And this comes from the Journal of Personality and Psychology. And the article is called Evidence That Gendered Wording in Job Advertisements Exists and Sustains Gender Inequality. So some masculine coded words include active, adventurous, challenge, driven, independent. And some feminine coded words include agree, commit, cooperate, depend, interpersonal. So that's just to give you some example. Interestingly, when pro-diversity language is included on a job description, people are less likely to scrub out their demographic, they're identifying information, like what clubs and organizations they belong to. But if that language is missing, people are basically erasing parts of themselves out. So that really challenges authenticity in the first place, and will probably make it harder for you to be able to figure out who belongs where. You also want to make sure that you only include in the description that information that's absolutely necessary to perform the job well. And the reason is because there is studies that have shown that women tend to apply only when they feel like they match nearly all of the qualifications. However, men, as long as they have about 60%, they're good. They're going to try. Okay, recruit outside your comfort zone, and this goes to some of the things that Anna was talking about earlier. You have to become engaged. This is ultimately a relationship game. And all we're trying to say is change who you're relating with. Go to a broader circle. Go to different places. And trust me, different groups are very welcoming as long as there's a genuine interest in getting to know. Ensure that you're also posting on sites that cater to diverse communities. And finally, this was based on some information from the tech organizations in Silicon Valley. Most of them just relied on Stanford because it was nearby and because, good quality. But it was having a disservice to those who graduated from MIT or other really good schools. So just make sure you understand what other programs would be available, where in other schools are there comparable programs that you can actively recruit for that particular job. Number 5, you want to evaluate every resume the exact same way. So there are programs out there that can strip demographic information. That's one way to try and make things anonymous. There's also, it's important to develop a standard evaluation form with detailed metrics so that everybody's evaluating the same criteria. Number 6 is to identify what you want before the interview begins. So if you are clear about the skills and the qualities, the credentials, etc., that would best serve the position, then you can craft questions that speak to those specific skills and credentials, etc. You can develop a checklist of these factors and give them to the interviewers beforehand so that everybody's clear. And finally, you want to prepare interviewers. Make sure that all interviewers are aware of the potential for bias. Make sure that you use a diverse panel of interviewers. Develop a set of interview questions that really speak to the skills and qualities and attributes. And finally, it's a message of hope. Your unconscious biases are just going to pop up no matter what. It takes some effort and some grit to keep trying to change these things, but just be patient, keep at it, and know that you'll get there. Questions, comments, happy juices? Anything on the live stream?
So, Ian, how do you help folks who feel like this may be unfairly, hindering the ability of some non-diverse candidates from, getting through the hiring process, who, that have trouble getting on board with doing this because they sort of have those, like it's somehow not fair. How do you address that?
That's a great question. How do you address it when some folks might feel like this is not fair? So there's a couple of things. First is you have to identify what's the self-interest. What's in it for the people that are talking about this is not fair. Anna had given some good statistics about how this ultimately enhances the business case. So being able to maybe use that as leverage to start to get people to see that, oh, this is actually in my interest as well. I could potentially grow my book of business or my line of business by 35% if I have, a more diverse team. So that's one thing. The second is it takes education. The reality is there isn't a level playing field yet, but people think there is. And so it takes sometimes some one-on-one conversations to try and explain that there are some discrepancies, and just getting to a point where you continue to educate folks. Anna, do you have ideas?
I would add to that, again, to bring it back to data, because if you get pushback, well, it's not fair for the rest of us, to be able to show with numbers, something is blocking all of these candidates. They're getting here and then they stop, and then they get to this point and then they all get filtered out. Some data that will show that the cards are stacked not against you, but against somebody else.
That's good.
There's a question from the live stream. What are your thoughts on using big data to eliminate bias?
Oh, great. We actually have our next presenter is going to talk about that, so I'm going to have her address it. But thank you for the question. Yes.
So, Ian, like an law firm, I work for a professional services firm, and the focus in recruiting is always, let's go to the top tier schools, however top tier school is defined, and that's the only place that the hiring manager will consider going. And I'm thinking that is just another form of bias, because you're screening out people that can't afford the $50,000 tuition, even with scholarships, they're not there. So do you have any tips on how you convince your hiring manager to consider recruiting from a state school?
Yeah, a pilot program. So I would initially start with providing some data that let's say the state school attracts a larger number of people, and from a particular background that we're targeting, and then use it as a pilot program to be able to show, the quality of work, the skill set that is just as good, even though the credential of the school is not, or the pedigree of the school is not quite as high as those top tier schools that they're used to recruiting. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of exposure, but you have to make that business case, I think, beforehand to get people to even understand this is worth trying a pilot.
And can I add, I think I would take that even further, because what you know is going to happen is, say you start your pilot, and then your hiring manager says, what was the bias that says you just see what you want to see? Confirmation bias?
Yeah, confirmation bias.
They're going to say, see, it's not worth it. Let's go back to what we were doing. So to be able to set them up and tell them what that bias is all about and educate them what that bias is, and have, again, very clear measure or definition of what it takes to be successful in that role. Do they have this? Are they doing this? Are they performing? So that you're only measuring that and you're not measuring emotions.
Yeah, and add infrastructure to that, because you can help mitigate a lot of bias by having processes in place to counteract it. So making sure that person gets appropriate feedback on their assignments, making sure that person is getting the right type of assignments, that they have the right mentors. There's a lot of little things to ensure that the pilot is a success. But I think that's probably the first step.
Can I add to that too? So we actually kind of did something similar to that. I work at University Corporation, and we typically went to bigger schools. So U of M was a big one, Madison, things like that. And recently trying to bring in some of those state schools just to get in and kind of increase our talent pool. So one of the things we started, because we had hiring managers who were a little bit more hesitant to switch it up and knew that they were always going to get, that talent that they were seeking at some of these bigger schools. And we had kind of a select few hiring managers that were on board right away. And so that's kind of where we started and did that pilot, was with those that were like, yep, I'm in, what do you need from me? I'm willing to go to new schools, different opportunities. We found that a lot of times when it's just HR throwing information at these hiring managers, they're a little hesitant to kind of believe what we're saying. And so when we have, bring in some of their peers and just other people outside of HR that they're used to working with and maybe trust a little bit more in a sense, we're successful in that end. And so when these hiring managers went to schools that weren't typically the big ones and then found success and were able to then share that with their colleagues, found a little bit less of a bias, and then being able to bring more hiring managers into some of those different schools. It definitely took time, and we still have some that are still, hesitant to kind of make the switch and are still going to their respective schools. But I think slowly we've been seeing more willingness from some of those hiring managers just from their colleagues being able to kind of share their experiences. So definitely a pilot. We just found that you're not going to be able to get everyone on board right away. It's kind of who can you choose to kind of be that platform to kind of test new schools. Those that that are just more than willing to take on new challenges and just very open and accepting of different strategies and schools and things like that. So
That's great. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so usually I make a joke of can everyone see me and stand behind the podium, but I'm not going to do that today. So I'm Jenrette-Thomas. I'm the America's Managing Director for WCN, which is a talent acquisition tech company. But I really consider myself one of you guys. So I've spent almost my entire career as a practitioner, actually focusing on campus recruiting, college recruiting. First at Lehman Brothers before they went under, and then before joining WCN, I was at Credit Suisse as the global COO of campus recruiting. So, and then I decided, well, forget about Wall Street, let me move over to the tech side, which is a lot more fun. So I come to you today to talk about big data, but really wearing that practitioner hat versus, but with a little bit of tech as well, just because that's what I've been doing. So let me just. So quickly, I just, in case people are like, what's WCN? I'm going to do like a 30-second, commercial, if you will. My head of sales told me to say that. So just quickly, we're a public company, global, headquartered in London. I'm based in New York, and again, as I said, talent acquisition, tech suite of company, tech company. Been around tons of clients, big names like NBC and BlackRock, and which I just think is really fun. But everyone in London is like, oh, big deal. I'm like, no, it's so cool. So just quickly, we have a whole suite of products around talent acquisition. So everything from what we were talking about earlier, like it's not just when the candidate applies. It's about starting to engage with them beforehand, whether it's events at college and engaging with them, or recruit product when they're actually applying, and then we have to interview them. And, so it's an interview schedule all the way through, and you're managing your interns. Mobility is about managing intern mobility and things like that. And then we have intelligence, which is our big data piece, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, but more of just in theory as well. So just like sort of quickly about that. And then again, really quickly, we have all sorts of tailored solutions, whether it's for college recruiting. We're really big in high volume, diversity, veterans. So again, just a quick taster. I can talk later, but that's my question. Okay. So let's talk about artificial intelligence and big data. And so it was interesting. I'm sort of like this huge geek, and I read Harvard Business Review. So this past fall, Anne is shaking her head like, yes, you probably saw this article in September. I'm going to read this out. I hate reading slides, but I am going to read this out. So it says, studies have shown that while humans can provide useful input, algorithms do a better job in the role of final decision maker. Which is really amazing when you think about that. And if I think about big data and artificial intelligence, like we're using this so much in our everyday lives right now. So one way I've avoided tons of fights with my husband is we use Waze, their algorithm. Like, so now we've argued which is the fastest way to get to the airport. And, I like to go down, one highway, he likes the other. Well, what do we do now to avoid the fight? We just plug in the address in Waze. Waze tells us, using their algorithm, using all the different data points. So I know stuff, and I like to go up, we're done, right? Like it's just Waze. And so it's these easy, simple things that we're using in everyday lives. Like think about another good example is like Amazon, which I'm obsessed about. I get packages every day. I don't even go to the stores anymore. Amazon is using things that I bought to give me really good recommendations that they think I'm going to want to buy. So how are they doing that? They're using big data and algorithms. They're using my purchasing past behavior, they're using all of yours, and they're doing all sorts of, data crunching with data scientists to give us, really great recommendations. So again, it's like part of our everyday life right now. So, well, why do we think, what about recruiting? Like, how can this apply to recruiting? So, my first question, raise the hands. Is anyone using big data, artificial intelligence? So my first question is raise your hand here. What's big data? It's okay. Okay, so for those on live stream, no one's raising their hand, but that's good. Okay, so next question. Is anyone just beginning to use any sort of big data type of thing in their hiring process? No one is raising their hand. So then, no one clearly has established it. So this is good. So we're going to talk about big data and how you can use it or think about using it. So, and again, so let me just talk about why. So, why, we call it intelligence at WCM, artificial intelligence, big data. So we have some clients that, and more like we think about campus recruiting, we're talking about school recruiting, that they need to hire, 3,000 people, college students, and they get 150,000 applications. I mean, the college recruiting season for them is crunched into, a couple months. So it's well, how do they do that? How do other organizations, what if I said, you want to hire 50 superstars, let's say 50 superstar diverse, people before your competitors? That would be interesting on why big data, or what about forget about the first 50. I want to get another 50 that I'm not even looking at now, and my competitors aren't even looking at either. Well, that sounds, again, very interesting. Or again, very specifically, let's hire more to match, our community, whether it's, I'm making it 50% gender, diversity, however it's divided. Just a side note, we were talking, earlier with different areas of diversity. A lot of areas I'm hearing now around diversity, new areas around socioeconomic diversity as well. So I'm going to just touch on that a little bit later as well, but it's just something to think about in the back of your mind, just other ways. How could you recruit in days versus months, weeks, etc. Or I would say could big data save your team 30% of their time. So what we have, so it's interesting, is with WCM, we developed a big data algorithm that right now will predict the instant a candidate applies with 90% accuracy, a third of those people that someone's going to want to hire. This is just for the college early career type of application. So experience hiring, we were talking about a Target, some of the tech stuff where they're more established. It doesn't work, but for our campus recruiting organizations, imagine, so take a step back. If you imagine, the second a candidate applies, if you had an algorithm, you had a recommendation that said, you know what, there's a probability that you're going to want to hire this candidate, 95% probability. Think about that, and how that might change the way you interact with that candidate or fast tracking you. Or think about so we're talking about applications, but if you think about that from an engagement standpoint, if they're starting to engage with you or they're going to an event, and I'm looking at a couple of the lawyers in the room, so when it's your turn, oh my God, you can't exactly do it. But if you start to think about how you, instantly, if you had this information about a candidate that you were likely to hire them or likely to give them an offer or likely to, you could really start to change the way your process works. So we think things like that is a game changer, whether it's an algorithm or in other companies are out there doing stuff, but think about artificial intelligence. And so again, let's talk about, I have 4 examples of where this can be a real game changer and how you think about artificial intelligence and overlaying it into your recruiting process. So what? Connect and engage with candidates first. So if you have a candidate, again, that applies, and if we think of campus recruiting where you have instantly, if you have an issue with tons of applications from certain schools you're going to, if you instantly knew the second that candidate applied that, again, huge percentage of probability we're going to end up hiring them, or certainly, interviewing them, you could do so many different things. You could start to engage with them. Maybe again, looking at the lawyers that are because you want to have that very specific process. But if you had a very specific process, you could start to maybe
invite them right away to an interview. You can start to have like a special dinner with them, to engage with them. Like it's all about, again, connecting with them first, before your competitors do, and developing a relationship with them. So when it's time to actually make them that offer, they're gonna wanna choose you. So before, your competitors. So you think about, like you were talking about, is it MIT or whatever the school. So okay, everyone's going there. So great, but what if you could get to those candidates first the second they apply? And then, well, you have to do an interview process, but have to anonymize everything. Like, again, so I think, think about that. Again, speed and and people are starting to use this. So it's only gonna get more and more and more. So you got to think about this in your recruiting process. So speed, connecting with the person. So we were talking about schools that you don't go to and earlier other sources and whatnot. And so a lot of things that I hear from people that, whether we work with or not, is that, I want to go to other schools, but I'm worried, or I have other sources, but I'm worried I'm going to get so many applications, or I only go to these schools, and again, there's this worry of like, these pools of candidates that people aren't connecting with. And so if you have a way to easily sort through all these applications in a really fast way, you're not going to leave anyone behind. So there's certain sources, like we were saying, okay, that company knows Stanford really well, but they don't trust the MIT, or they don't trust the state schools. But if you had a very specific way of letting look at everyone the same way, then that's more data and evidence. So let me take a step back for a second. So here's a question. 60% of Fortune 1000 CEOs graduated from how many different universities? 2. Raise your hand if you think it's 15. Okay, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. So 2/3 in the room. Raise your hand if you think it's 75. Maybe 10% in the room. What about 250? There's 1 in the room. So I think some people in the room have seen this stat before, because usually I get the opposite. It's 15. It's 15 universities. So we were talking about earlier where it's like, we're only going to certain schools. What about all these amazing candidates outside your core schools, your target schools, at University of nowhere, where I don't recruit at? What about these great candidates? Like they're the cream of the crop. If you had a way where that when they actually applied, instead of them going to this black hole, because that's what happens a lot of times if you are getting applications. Again, and maybe that's not just schools. Maybe there's different sources. They're going into this black hole. Again, if you have a way, we can quickly identify who again, high likelihood of you hiring them or interviewing them. You're not going to be in that black hole anymore. So I think there's this huge opportunity to use artificial intelligence to expand your sources and look beyond. And don't let, like we have this picture of like, no child left behind. But what's that from, like the 80s? But it's that kind of thing. Like, don't let any of these great candidates get left behind because you don't have a process set up to go through all of your applications. I mean, obviously that's more for someone who has a ton of applications. If you're not getting so many, well then we need to talk about that issue. But this is where where you have too many candidates. So the big thing why we're here: reduce bias. Reduce bias. So we've talked about it was like this, and this is the perfect setup. So there is this unconscious bias in our selection process, and if you have an algorithm so we've taken out all of these pieces out of the algorithm, out of our algorithm, so it's not even looking at diversity. It's not, you can tune it in a way where it takes, literally, the algorithm takes out all this implicit bias, or there was 10 different biases. If you pull that out, and a machine can actually just decide, in an unbiased way, that's huge, because, you've just taken that whole human bias out. And so that's a huge piece. And so, it's interesting, and I have, sort of a slide later on that we'll talk about. It's one day is it going to be where, we need to use it from a legal standpoint. So right now, lawyers are oh, no, this artificial intelligence, but it could be down the road where we're going to say, you know what, this is the better way to do your selection process. The algorithm does it better way. It's not biased. We could be in a role one day, we're of course you have to use, and now you have to use the computer to make this because it's going to make better decisions for you. And if you don't use it, that could be, you could make yourself in legal hot water. So, again, if you're taking it out and you have these great candidates, so example with the Jamal and Greg, Algorithm doesn't care what your name is, doesn't care what, where, any of the diversity, right? It's just gonna, based on, hundreds of thousands of different data points, it's gonna say, this person, taking out any of that bias, has a high likelihood, 90% likelihood of getting it on. There's none of that. Like, what was the percentage? All that goes away. It just can go away, right? Fine tuning down rather than doing it the right way. So again, that's like a huge area that artificial intelligence can help. And then time. So, one thing we haven't, talked about as well, but if you are spending time looking at all these applications and screening them and whatnot, like it's, I think we did, if you'll say 10 recruiters on your team, and they, to get through all the applications, let's say an example of campus recruiting, 2 months of like screening applications, and automatically an algorithm can just say, hey, we think these are the ones you should look at. Well, what does that allow the recruiter to do? It allows you to have actually a lot of free time to then go and personalize the process and take maybe that top bid and go ahead and start like calling them up, farming them out to the right people, whether it's like if you have diversity network, and just really, really personalize the process because you have free time. So I feel like one of the big issues in recruiting is like it's so admin like heavy. You gotta screen, you gotta like change your status, you gotta do that. It's just there's a lot of admin. But if you have that extra time to like, what's our job type? Like recruiter, to actually recruit and not just be like the admin. Like that's huge. So again, and if you have this extra time, what can you do? You can start to engage with the candidates, you can engage with your business, you can make sure you're going after the right sources. So it's this whole, snowball effect that comes around. So 4 ways artificial intelligence can help. And so again, well, I guess I went ahead and said my slide earlier, but like literally, we joke around this, but this is true. It's like one day, people may really say, like in a court of law, like, what, you didn't let the computer like make the decision? Think about it. So one of my colleagues was supposed to be here today, but his plane had engine trouble. And so what happened, was it the pilot that decided? No, it was the computer that probably like flagged something that was like, hey, engine trouble, don't take off, And so we think about like all these different ways right now, if like, again, a plane crashes, what do they do? Like, oh, did the pilot override the controls of the computer? And so we're very much about like, why would you override the computer? We think about that in a lot of different ways right now in our life. I mean, you can imagine it, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, like how many years from now, where literally people are going to look at our recruiting process, our hiring process, and be like, really, you can make that decision? Like, I mean, we're not there yet, but like, you could see a world where we really could be there, and not so far away. It was interesting. There was a lawsuit where a company, and I don't have all the details, but basically a company was using an outdated online assessment test that actually had an adverse impact on their candidates. And because there was like so many online tests that you can take, and personality, and that this company was using an outdated one. And so they actually had to pay a fine and start using a more up-to-date or modern, like an online assessment type of tool. So you can see if the courts are starting to say some of this, like you can't have adverse impact in your selection process, whether that's an online test or whatnot. So you can imagine that those types of things could be, again, sooner rather than later, where they're like, well, you have to use some sort of like unbiased algorithm or something to make some sort of recommendation. So I feel like it's coming sooner than we think. And so just quickly, a lot of people are like, okay, well, you're talking, well, what could this sort of look like? So this is, again, a screenshot of a product, candidates' names, and here's the interview probability. So here it's saying Dan has a 91% probability of receiving an interview. And then if you were to like click into Dan, like it shows, well, why does Dan have a 91% interview probability or 75% probability of receiving an offer? And it goes through all like what's the big data algorithm looking at? Is Is it work experience? Is it their education? Is it their test scores? Is it other non-quantitative? Particular here it has he was captain of the varsity hockey team. Test results. So all sorts of and just to give a sense because at first we're not going to trust some of these algorithms. And so that's what we see a lot of people starting to use. Use this, see what the prediction is, understand why, and then do your regular selection process. But then see, did the algorithm say what you guys ended up choosing? And so it's sort of this interesting, let it see how it goes. So use the word highlight. So that's what we have a lot of our clients starting to do. But this is the future that's sort of coming. So, and what I always like to say is think of this again as a recommendation algorithm. So, this is I took this, my screenshot last night. This is my Amazon recommendations. I have a daughter who's in kindergarten and a 3rd grade son. So clearly my 3rd grader is really into Beyblades, so it's recommending I buy more Beyblades movies on Amazon. And my daughter, well, I've been buying her some of these I'm Jane Goodall and women in science kind of thing. So, these are good. And I was doing some cooking and I may have just recently binge watched Twilight, so not bad, it's fine. So again, really good recommendations from Amazon. So again, think about, so there we go. So that's, quick, my story for, sorry, but so that's driving you. So I'm more engaged with Amazon. Your candidates can be more engaged with you and you know, so thank you. Let's talk about big data. Questions, comments, you guys using this? This is crazy. This is the future here.
So a question is, if a company isn't yet recruiting at a school or hasn't hired certain types of diverse candidates, where does the data come to tell them that that candidate might have a 38% chance of getting an offer?
That's a great question. So I'll repeat it for those on the live stream. So basically, if you haven't recruited at a school before, where does the algorithm get its data from? So we have it's obviously an index that looks at, there's all sorts of open source data, whether you go out to LinkedIn and we can understand where people moved and whatnot. So, for us, we have this index that can just be overlaid on our client system. And what's interesting is then the view is, okay, let's, use that, see how it goes, and then the following year start to take more of your, custom internal data, talk about performance and see how people are doing if you're a company, and you can then tweak the algorithm. But we have a base one that we've developed. And again, other companies out there have things like this as well, where they have their, base index or whatnot, and then you use that, and then, some allow you to customize it, some don't. So I think that's huge, is big data is bigger than just, because it has to have so many data points and whatnot. It has to be bigger than just one organization. You have to have a lot of information in order to develop it. So that's what I would say. Is look for companies that have something you can use right away.
So just kind of tie into the same question. So are you doing, you're making efforts trying to structure the algorithm from bad biases and whatnot? Or not? Because just use outcomes as it's going to be reaffirming existing mechanisms, right? So you're just going to be looking at the same schools and then there's some biases. You purposefully go to your algorithm and say you're going to remove biases.
Yeah, so we have all these data scientists who are working, and I don't even understand what they're saying half the time. But yeah, and I think that's important, because if you build an algorithm on bad process or bad selection, then it just perpetuates that biased selection process. So you have to fine tune all that out to make sure that it's not just based on bad, existing outcomes.
Right.
So that's,
because Facebook has no problem with the newsfeed, right? They're going to say that we're going to feed you if you make a bunch of bad choices, or you bad choices on Amazon for that matter.
Right.
You get a bunch of bad recommendations that might reveal from an objective perspective bad. So how do you protect against that? How do you help customers avoid bad choices at the end?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's one of the reasons why we had our data scientists, create a standard index, because it takes out all those biases, and then it's working with with clients and others throughout the org, not just recruiting, everyone to understand, okay, as you fine tune it, don't fine tune it to an organization that has a bad bias process. So that's the key. So we're just rolling this out, so we'll, that'll be a piece we need to look at, but we have to take all that you can. It's like, what is that, garbage in, garbage out? We have time for one more. I'm getting the hook.
So, no, I'm.
Oh, not the hook, sorry, no hook.
But, not the hook yet. One of the things I think that's hard is, it really depends on your organization and how sophisticated you are in the ways that you're hiring, and some of the questions people were asking about, just the opportunity to go to different schools. I think the key is to start thinking in terms of data, and that was one clear message throughout today, is that the more you can have concrete data to look at and then to go to your hiring managers or to go to your bosses to say, here's the proof that, for instance, the people that I hired from the state school actually are longer term employees who work very hard and are passionate about what they do. And when we hire someone from MIT, they stay for a year because they have lots and lots of options. So, you can find a lot of that in your data. And what we've found is that it's not data that's always being collected even right now. It takes time, and it takes the idea of making sure you have the data. So I think that might be a place to start for some of the smaller organizations before, to not be overwhelmed by this idea of big data. Eventually you'll get to it, but that might be a way to step in, just like we're talking about piloting too. Step in the water by getting some hardcore data in your own organization and talking to maybe your peers about some of their data, and just starting to get comfortable with it, That's a great point.
I would add also to bring back, to really evaluate what it takes to be successful in a role, because anyone who's ever been on a hiring team has had that conversation where you look through a resume together and somebody says, well, I don't like that they've written this because that means they are XYZ. That's a proxy, and you have to be careful of identifying proxies versus real indicators. And that has to be part of the conversation when if you work with someone on building that algorithm. Are you identifying proxies, or are you identifying real indicators of success?
And I would add, as the employment lawyer in the room, and I'll cover this in my presentation too, that the indicators really should be job related to the specific position that the person is being considered for, and the specific skills that the position requires, the responsibilities and duties of that position.
That's great.
Thanks, Jenrette. Okay, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Ives, and I want to thank you all so much for coming today and also for joining us online. I'm an attorney at Stinson Leonard Street, and my specialty is employment law. I work regularly with human resources professionals as well as recruiters to both counsel them with respect to best practices before a lawsuit starts, and also I litigate matters once a problem arises and assist employers in defending against lawsuits as well. So today I'm going to piggyback off of the prior presenters to talk a little bit about best practices in the recruiting process and how employers can avoid discrimination lawsuits. There's three primary topics that I'm going to cover today. First, I'll talk about how employers can use big data and comply with non-discrimination requirements. I'll also speak a little bit about data that that employers may solicit during the recruiting process and pitfalls that employers can run into when soliciting specific data points, including data about a candidate's criminal background and their pay history. I'll also talk briefly about how employers can ensure that their electronic recruiting devices, their online applications, their web apps can be accessible to individuals with disabilities, because that's an area where we're seeing increasing lawsuits. So Jenrette gave us a great overview of big data and how it's being used by employers. I'll speak about this just briefly, but this is a growing area, and I think that it's something that we're certainly going to, that it is truly the wave of the future, that employers are using data more and more, not only to identify and recruit candidates, but also internally to determine, who is the appropriate person for promotion, what kind of raise should we give them. Data sets are helping employers evaluate the performance of their employees and also really understand employee preferences, their habits and skill sets, to better to create a better workplace. There has been data from both Deloitte and the Society for Human Resources Management recently, studies that were done by both of those organizations really showing that employers are increasingly using both external market data sets as well as internal data sets based on data that they've acquired from their own employees to do these different tasks here. And as Jenrette covered, with respect to recruiting specifically, employers are really relying on data sets to reduce recruiting costs, to shorten the amount of time that it takes to recruit candidates and to identify appropriate candidates for a position. And it's also seen as an opportunity to reduce separation costs by recruiting the appropriate and the best candidate for the position, which will hopefully allow a company to retain critical talent. As with any recruiting device or any employment practice, there's certainly risks and rewards to using big data. And Jenrette talked a lot about the rewards. As a lawyer here, I'll talk a little bit about the risks, which is my job. Certainly, there's the possibility that using big data or using a specific algorithm could create or perpetuate discrimination and bias. We talked about that a little bit following Jenrette's presentation. But there's the possibility that an employer could say, I have these top performers, here are their attributes, go find specific potential applicants that meet these attributes. And while the attributes themselves may not be, this person is white or this person is a male, or they may not be specific demographic characteristics, they could correlate strongly to those type of characteristics, and unwittingly the algorithm or the data set could perpetuate that type of discrimination and bias. The data could potentially be unreliable, it could be inaccurate or incomplete. Another risk is that the data could have the unintended effect of using protected information. So if the data is gathering from information about a person's activities or their likes and dislikes, it could, for instance, find out that the person is active or supports different medical initiatives, and that could be correlated to the fact that the person has a certain medical condition. And that information could be protected information under the Federal Genetic Non-Disclosure Information Act. That's just an example of how the use of big data could potentially lead to the unintended disclosure of protected information. There are obviously major rewards as well with the use of big data. As Jenrette talked about, there's a possibility that using big data and using algorithms could actually eliminate discrimination and bias. One example would be that data could potentially expand an employer's traditional applicant pool, and instead of relying on referrals or word of mouth, which tends to solicit recruits from within a person's own affinity group, it could expand the potential group of applicants and allow for recruiting in more diverse groups. And also, as we talked about earlier, can create a more productive workforce by identifying better applicants that have higher retention rates. This is a developing area that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is watching. And I do believe that we are going to see more litigation related to big data and the use of artificial intelligence in employment. The EEOC held a panel on the topic of big data and its use by employers in October of 2016. Interestingly, this panel was organized by then EEOC Commissioner Victoria Lipnick, who was following that was named the acting chair of the EEOC by President Trump. So as the now acting chair, we could expect that there's potentially will be continued interest in this area. And the EEOC has itself signaled that it noted that data-driven selection devices are one of its areas of particular concern in its 4-year strategic enforcement plan. That's a plan that lays out areas where the EEOC is paying particular attention to different topics and sets forth the EEOC's enforcement goals. There has not been a large lawsuit related to the use of artificial intelligence, specifically in the area of recruiting. But legal commentators believe that there may be a basis for potential lawsuits under a number of different federal statutes, which are identified here. And I'll speak a little bit about what most legal commentators believe could be a potential litigation point is under a disparate impact theory, which essentially the type of lawsuit that would be brought is by a group of people that have a protected class underneath one of these lawsuits. So for instance, a person of color, based on sex, based on disability, who allege that they have been excluded or otherwise discriminated against because of a employment practice that is not intentionally discriminatory. So there may not be any intentional discrimination, but rather there's a neutral employment practice that has the effect of creating discrimination. So for instance, one of the examples that the EEOC considered in their October 2016 panel was the use of, in an algorithm, the use of someone's zip code. That an employer, for instance, may select to include only applicants within a certain radius of their employment site and not include other zip codes that are potentially further away. That could have the unintended consequence of perhaps excluding certain neighborhoods and excluding, for instance, people of color if they live in that neighborhood, or whatever affinity group may be present in that particular area. So it's an example of a neutral decision that obviously has no discriminatory intent, creating a potentially discriminatory impact by not even allowing a certain group in the door to be considered as an applicant. Another example would be that legal commentators have talked about is the algorithm may create for instance, say, that this certain candidate has a projected rate of absenteeism, and it could exclude the candidate because they're likely to be absent from work. But if the reason for those absences has something to do with a medical condition or a disability, the employer could unwittingly exclude that person based on the fact that they may be disabled or have a medical reason for not being able to be present at work. This type of discrimination is being referred to as digital discrimination, and it is a very much developing area of the law. Some legal commentators believe that the way that our current statutes are written don't even necessarily anticipate the ability, or don't anticipate the digital revolution that we're now in. And so I think we will see the law really being performed by these different lawsuits as they start to come up. So there are some best practices that we're advising our clients to put into place if they are using big data. Jeanette talked a little bit about the importance of allowing the computer to do the work. I'm going to push back a little bit on that and say that we do really recommend that employers ensure that there's responsible oversight when they're using big data. So that means that recruiters and managers do need to be well trained in non-discrimination principles, and they need to be reviewing what's actually happening with the data set and the outcomes that are occurring. And if there are disparate impacts or adverse impacts on particular groups, an employer needs to be proactively addressing those. Employers also need to put in safeguards to prevent discrimination. We talked a little bit about making sure that the algorithm or the data set is actually evaluating someone's ability to do the job and not just their demographic characteristics. So the algorithm should be measuring someone's knowledge, skills, and abilities that are specifically related to the job at issue and not their demographic characteristics. Employers should always audit the results of any big data that they're using, and they should retain the data as well. So by auditing, an employer needs to make sure that the data set that they're using is actually representative, that it's inclusive, and that it's accurate. I'll turn now to discuss a few other topics that are not related to big data, but that have to do with data that an employer may solicit during the recruitment process. Specifically, I'll talk a little bit about criminal background information and wage history information, which are two areas of the law that have been hot topics in recent years. So during the recruitment process, employers may ask candidates questions. Some of those questions may relate to their criminal background. Some employers may even require a background check prior to hiring someone. The EEOC has been very active in this area. They issued a guidance on employers' use of arrest and conviction records back in April of 2012. The concern here is that this type of information tends to exclude disproportionately people of color. Similarly, states have been very active in this area, and there have been numerous states that have adopted laws that are so-called ban-the-box laws that apply to private employers. These ban-the-box laws are given that name because they typically have the effect of requiring private employers to eliminate from their employment applications the checkbox that a person was previously asked to check if they had either previously been arrested or had a conviction. Generally, the ban-the-box laws that have been passed in different locations, and I'll show you where they have been. These are just ban-the-box laws that apply to private employers. Many other localities have passed laws that apply to public employers. They take different forms. Some prohibit or limit the use of a person's arrest information, so just information about if someone has been arrested. Some impose time limits on the use of conviction information. So in the case where someone was arrested and then convicted of a crime, the ban-the-box law with a limitation on when an employer can consider that information. So for instance, here in Minnesota, the law requires that an employer cannot consider conviction information until after a conditional job offer has been made. Other ban-the-box laws also prohibit or limit the information of even considering a job applicant's credit information. Obviously, this kind of patchwork of laws throughout the country creates a challenge for employers who are employing employees throughout our country. But there are best practices that employers should follow. The first step is determining, do we even really need to gather this information about someone's criminal background? How is it helping us? And if it is determined that we are wanting to do a background check, employers should make sure that they're complying with the EEOC's guidance, which requires that the criminal background check is really assessed in a very individualized way. So the employer needs to determine what is the conviction for? When did the conviction occur? Does it have any relationship whatsoever to the person's ability to do this job? If there is a decision that a person's criminal background disqualifies them for the particular position, employers need to make sure that they're following the specific process that's mandated by the Fair Credit Reporting Act for communicating that decision to employers, or to applicants, excuse me. I'll turn now to discuss pay equity. This is another area that we've seen a growing focus on at both the federal and the state level. And specifically what's particularly important to focus on the recruiting process is new laws that have been banning employers from asking a candidate about their salary or wage history at any point during the hiring process. So that means that an employer cannot ask, what were you previously paid at your prior employer? Law was just passed in New York City. It's been passed in the other locations that are listed on the slide. We think that this is going to be expanding across the country. So employers need to take note and consider, is this something we should be asking candidates about on our job applications? And if we are doing it, how do we make sure that there's no pay inequity that's created? Because the whole purpose of these laws is the belief that basing a candidate's pay or their negotiation of their pay on their prior pay tends to perpetuate pay inequity, and particularly wage gaps between women and men. Lastly, I'll talk a little bit about website accessibility. This is a area of increased litigation that we've seen under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Disabled individuals have brought lawsuits against employers and other companies alleging that their websites are not accessible to individuals with disabilities. We've seen a particular rise in these types of lawsuits related in the financial services industry, but it applies in the recruiting context as well. If you're using a website or a mobile app or social media to recruit candidates, you need to make sure that your platforms are accessible to individuals with disabilities. There have not been any specific guidelines that have been issued by the Department of Justice, although they've been anticipated for a number of years at this point. I'm not sure if we'll see them anytime soon. However, in where lawsuits have occurred, the Department of Justice has indicated that compliance with the guidelines that have been issued by a private consortium, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines noted here, do meet the requirements of Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. With that, I'll thank you for your attendance here today, and I'm certainly eager to answer any questions that you may have, and also excited to open up the cocktail hour as well.
So Jenny, in terms of this, oversight, is it better to, have the detailed information, or to be at, kind of a higher level if you're, of what goes on in the algorithm? I mean, how much do you really want to dig into the detail of that? And, I'm sure it's a daunting task for a lot of people to, go into that level of detail, but would you advise that they actually do it, or that they stay a little bit above that? Or what do you
I think that's a very challenging issue for employers to sort out, because employers want to recruit diverse candidates, and the only way to recruit diverse candidates is to know about their diversity. And many employers, rightly so, feel very hamstrung by their inability to ask specific questions to gauge diversity. Especially when they may be federal contractors, they may have specific affirmative requirements to have a diverse workforce. But at the same time, employers are also very wary of stepping into a potential lawsuit by asking someone about their sexual orientation, or asking someone about, do you have kids? What is your marital status? Those are protected statuses in some states, including in Minnesota, where familial status and sexual orientation are protected characteristics. So I think employers really have feel like it's hard to sort out, do we ask the personalized information or not? Generally, as an advisor, I advise employers not to ask specific questions about someone's protected status or their demographic characteristics during the recruiting process. If a candidate voluntarily discloses that information, that's fine, but soliciting that information can be risky in a non-discrimination lawsuit.
But how about in the context of big data, and analysis of big data? You really you advise employers to really engage with folks like WCN to get into the weeds and understand how it all works, or to let them do that and have that be their business. And it's got to be a bit of a dilemma for the employer. How much do they get into that detail?
Right, and that's a great question. It is a dilemma, and for some employers, it's great. They simply do not have the capacity to assess that in an intelligent and comprehensive way. I think employers do need to ask questions. They need to find out, okay, where is the data being pulled from? How do we ensure that it's accurate? How do we ensure that it's free from bias, from biases? How do we make sure that it's not incomplete? So employers do need to ask those difficult questions. I know some employers even ask for indemnification provisions. But certainly employers do need to know what are we relying on.
So they can't just say, ignore it, stick their head in the sand and say, we didn't know any of this. That's not good enough.
No, I think that no court is going to buy that as a defense to a potential lawsuit.
So question just related to that, if the tools are used, whether it's big data or other online assessment tests or things like that, as a recommendation versus like, okay, if it's like going like this says, this is top candidate and I will automatically hire them. If there's that, like, it's just an extra input into your process, does that change and then assuming then is, you're not making biased decisions, right? Implicit or not, or like, how does that change? Does that change versus just relying on this algorithm or this online personality test said this, I'm just hiring the top 10% and, forget about the rest. Like, does that change sort of from a legal standpoint?
Well, I think that, in any decision, there's going to be some kind of discretion. The employer, is exercising discretion in order to determine who is hired. I think where the potential legal problem comes in is if in a potential lawsuit, a court is going to look at, okay, well, what was the pool? Were you looking at a pool of candidates that was in fact diverse, or that was not diverse? And if you're as you said before, if there's garbage in is kind of garbage out, you want to make sure that you're not, even if you're exercising discretion, that the discretion is being exercised in a way where you're not potentially running afoul of a non-discrimination law.
What are your thoughts on employers either preferring or sometimes even requiring that students come from certain schools or are from certain majors? If the employers don't really have any data to show that those schools or majors actually result in more productive employees. We've had some discussions at College Recruiter with a couple of our clients recently that have basically become school agnostic, because when they look back at people who have been with them for 3, 4, 5 years, they find that there's actually no correlation at all between what school they went to, who's still with them, who's productive. And Ernst & Young in the UK even found an inverse relationship between the quality of the school and the quality of the employee. So, you know, for those of us who went to decent schools, clearly that's a flawed methodology. I'm looking at you, Steve. But what are your thoughts, Jenny, on that? Because it's widely accepted in the college recruiting space that you have your primary school, your core schools, your secondary schools, certain majors, and it's just sort of accepted that that's where the best candidates come from.
Right. You know, I think that this, you know, there's not necessarily a legal issue with recruiting from a specific school versus another one, although I think that we talked, it does create kind of an interesting question about, are those schools proxies for discrimination, because only certain students are able to get into the very elite schools, and are we somehow excluding other candidates from other groups because they're not able to either to pay, frankly, for those very expensive educations. So I think this is really something where employers just need to look at their own internal data set and see what their experience is, and know that, you know, it's hard for many of us to not go with the kind of the fancy brand name. But this is a situation where, you know, if you have had a great experience with candidates from schools that aren't in the Ivy League, it just doesn't make sense from a business perspective to target solely those institutions. Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming, and looking forward to getting the chance to speak to some of you. And we'll certainly continue the conversation online, and we have our hashtag if you want to post anything on Twitter as well.
Well, I just wanted to thank our presenters today. I think it was really very intriguing and interesting conversation around how to hire diverse candidates and how to keep them, and how to attract them, and how to ensure that we're trying to eliminate bias, which we all have, whether we want to admit it or not. So I think it was a great discussion. I really appreciate hearing it. I hope the 67 viewers on our live stream enjoyed it as well. And I just wanted to make sure to let you know you can also watch the recorded version on youtube.com at College Recruiter, and definitely feel free to continue the conversation. Thanks a lot.